I'm Kendra Ruth, here to answer one of your questions about marriage and midlife crisis. Today we have Rachel. Rachel is asking or giving more information as a follow-up. She has a bomb drop of March 13th, 2022, and she now says that they a date of marriage of 2003, and her contact type, which she didn't know before, is boomerang, and energy level, which she didn't know before, was low energy wallower. She says, I wrote in and you answered my question last time. I'd like to give a little bit more information. My husband had left in the middle of the night, and that was bomb drop, and then he just left. Our marriage had been good, and people often came to us for advice. Our grown son and his girlfriend and 2 kids were living with us, and the temporary move had turned into several months. Shortly after my husband moved out, our dog had to be put to sleep. He took her. She had congestive heart failure. I believe that his ED is physical. So he has ED. Sex has never been a huge part of our marriage, but it was always good, just not super frequent. He turned 49 in December. I took the MLC quiz, and I do believe he's in a midlife crisis. He called me from his therapist's office in July and said he was ashamed and so sorry. But the therapist had told him he'd had a mental breakdown. He continued to see a therapist to make life decisions, and we had been talking about the possibility of him coming home. I was then hospitalized in November, and he came home and moved back out in December. So no question, but let's just go over a little bit here. So first thing, if this is a midlife crisis, first, can a midlife crisis go faster than 2 to 7 years? Sure. There are a few things I worry about when that happens. I worry about if they are pulled out and don't go through the crisis, but they stop it, come out the opening, the front of the tunnel. They will go back in later for a much worse crisis. And by later, I don't mean next week. That's the same crisis. I don't mean in 2 months or 6 months. That's the same crisis. I mean in 10 years. So that is something to think about. And that means you haven't worked through the things. And that he hasn't worked through it. It's not just about repairing and making amends within the marriage. But why is he in a midlife crisis? Because that's personal to him. So I want to warn you about him coming home. I am not going to say he should or shouldn't. I let Chuck come home 8 times, and I think that it was beneficial in our situation. So I'm not going to tell you no, but I do want you to know what you're getting into when that happens. And the one thing that is very important, if they come home then at this early, they're unlikely to stay, and it will work. Unless it's one of those where they get yanked out and 10 years later, bomb drop again. So I'm not surprised. He came home in November to take care of you, didn't he? And there might not have even been a full intention that he was moving home. He was probably thinking, she needs me, and we'll see. And I don't know if he let you know that or not. But he wanted to see how it was and take care of you. There's nothing wrong with it. That's a good thing that he felt that he needed to do that for you. And I like that he has a therapist who told him he had a mental breakdown. Now, what does that mean? Has the therapist explained what that means? And what does a therapist feel it means? What does the therapist feel it means on timeline? How long do you have a breakdown before you come back together? And I don't mean as a reconciliation. I mean as a person. You break apart. Now, how long does it take to put yourself back together? So coming home is fine, but staying home is unlikely. Or staying home and getting toward repair, true rebuilding, unlikely. And so I want you to go in knowing that, and knowing that it may be better to say, you know what, neither of us are ready for you to come home right now. He is probably more of a clinging boomerang than a boomerang, because he came home. Yes, to take care of you, but that's a clinging tendency. He is probably a clinging boomerang because he called you from the therapist's office and told you he was ashamed and sorry. It seemed more than just, I'm sorry I'm doing this to you, but I have to do it. It seemed more, he was ashamed and sorry, and he wanted to undo it, but doesn't know how, doesn't know when. He doesn't have that capacity yet. You had been talking about the possibility of him coming home. That wouldn't be happening this early with a boomerang. So he's probably a clinging boomerang. So I want you to prepare yourself for a rough ride. But I also want you to get healed, because it doesn't have to be as rough as I say it is. It's rough when we don't accept, understand, or know why this is happening. And what I mean by that is when we have these expectations coming up. Oh, he's coming home, so things are getting better. Go to the forums and read all of the stories about my husband is home, my wife is home now. How long are those husbands and wives home? A lot of the people will come in then and say, well, when was your bomb drop? If your bomb drop was within this year, that they might be home. And they could be reverting to being an at-home MLCer. But it is highly unlikely, if it's a midlife crisis. Now, that's a big if it's a midlife crisis, that this is the final stage and getting to rebuilding for the marriage. This isn't a reconciliation. My husband came home 8 times. And I knew it wasn't ready. I knew he wasn't ready. The reason I let him come home is, first, we didn't have children, so I didn't have to worry about the damage, the in and outs. And I knew I could handle it. And I knew that I got to have an influence, and I could pave the way toward my healing. And he could see, and he could compare. He'd leave, and every time he moved out, he moved in with her. And then he'd move home with me. Now, that was also the axis of the issue we had to deal with, was no bed hopping, and you can't just move directly from one place to your wife's. And that was our challenge that we had to solve in the end. But he had a direct comparison, and I got to work on dealing with conflict in him. I got to work on detachment up front, not just the idea of detachment when he wasn't there. And so I think there were benefits for people who can't handle that and can't pull themselves off of the puddle that they have become on the floor. That's a lot. A premature return home is probably not beneficial. So, Rachel, I want you to think about whether you can handle these premature returns home. And if you can't, you reassure him. If you're standing, you give him reassurance. It's not that I don't want you here, but I want us to have the best chance of this working. And so I think that you need to continue on your path toward figuring your healing out. I have to heal. I have to heal from the pain of and the challenges of everything and the shock. And keep seeing your therapist. I'm often worried when an MLCer sees a therapist for individual therapy, because they can twist that. But I like that his therapist said he had a mental breakdown. It's not all therapists that are going to benefit during this time, but maybe he has one that will. And so far, just from what you've said, I like it. And that makes me think that I want to give a warning out toward people talking about how horrible the therapist is, and my MLC is seeing a therapist and they told him it's my fault, or they told him this, they did this, that what the therapist told the MLC, and sometimes that is the case. They said you're being abused. They said your MLC, your wife is twisting it. Your husband is horrible, and you should leave. And they tell him to leave. We don't know that that's true, unless you've spoken to the therapist about that. And when you talk, then the therapist shouldn't talk to you. That is a conflict of interest, and it does go against the boundary of the therapeutic privacy. It's frustrating. They shouldn't talk to you, but unless you have some of that information from the horse's mouth, do you really think that the person, your MLCer, that we have said on the forum and on the Facebook page, trust nothing what they say? They just lie. Well, why do you trust what they're saying is the truth when they say, my therapist said that it's your fault? Now, the next thing is, it might not be that they're lying, but they might be misinterpreting or twisting what their therapist is saying, because they will twist what they hear to fit their narrative and needs. So, in defense of therapists, they might not be taking the side you think they are, if the only information about the therapist you have is from your MLC. In this case with Rachel, it sounds like he's got somebody who is helping him in a beneficial way. You said, supposing he's seeing the same therapist, and I don't know if he is, But if that person can help guide them through the mental breakdown and put back together, that's awesome. I hope this is helpful. I'll see everybody in the next question.